Mr. Honner is a lawyer based in Ontario and is a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School and the University of Waterloo. He is former director at the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms from 2016 to 2022 and is a member of the Democracy Fund. Please help me welcome Mr. Honner.
Hi, everyone. I am the litigation director at the Democracy Fund. I'd like to thank We Unify for inviting me here to speak today.
You can just grab it too if you want.
Sure. I'd like to begin by telling you about one of my personal heroes, a man named Václav Havel. He was a Czech dissident, he was a playwright, and he was imprisoned for political activity. That political activity included defending a rock band. He went to jail for 4 years. After communism fell in Czechoslovakia, as it then was, he became the first president of that country. In one of his essays, called The Power of the Powerless, Václav Havel made an observation. And he said, if an observer who only studied the laws of Czechoslovakia, but who knew nothing about what life was actually like in that country, if this happened, this person would be utterly incapable of understanding what everybody was complaining about. That person would not see the political manipulation of the courts. He would not see the closed nature of trials. He would not see the selective application of the laws. That person would see that accused persons are provided with a lawyer and that criminal procedure is followed. And in fact, in communist Czechoslovakia, when a dissident was being prosecuted, the courts took extra steps to ensure that the appearance of justice was preserved.
Please, can you hold your mic a little closer to your mouth?
Canadian dissidents today, well, let me go back and say, why was this perseverance of the appearance of justice was so important in communist Czechoslovakia? Because it was not a classical dictatorship where the rulers could do whatever they wanted to. The government needed to legitimize their actions with the principle of legality. Now, Canadian dissidents today may feel a certain affinity with the Czechs of the 1970s and the 1980s. Our laws seem pretty good when you look at the books. What do we have to complain about? We have human rights at the provincial and federal level. We have privacy rights, and we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that guarantees us fundamental freedoms, due process, and equality. We've even signed off on international conventions which protect civil and political rights. But in practice, we find that the protections offered by law are not as robust as they seem. In the past few years, we have discovered that discrimination against the unvaccinated is not merely tolerated, but is encouraged by major institutions such as government, media, and universities. The human rights accommodations have been few and far between. We also thought that we had strong privacy laws. But when the organization I'm a part of, the Democracy Fund, brought a legal case before the Ontario Superior Court of Justice in an effort to protect students from University of Western Ontario from what we thought was the illegal gathering of their personal health information, we found out that the court interpretation of privacy law in Ontario was quite different than what we expected it to be, and it rendered the protections largely illusory. Now, of course, the biggest limitation to our rights, our civil rights, is built right into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms itself. Before that document discusses anything about freedom of religion or freedom of expression or any other right, it makes a point of saying that those rights are not fully guaranteed. They are subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law, as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic country. Now, whether we like it or not, our rights in Canada are anything but absolute. And I'm not disagreeing with Mr. Lugosi here, Dr. Lugosi. The court may have mangled the test, but the fact is, the situation we're in right now is not one where we have rights which are absolute. And that brings me to the point that I want to make. Given the situation we're in, a situation in which our rights are seriously qualified, we have to exercise the right of dissent with a certain measure of responsibility. Because if we are not careful, we will exercise the right of dissent to our own detriment and to the detriment of future generations. And I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. But for now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that we should be timid or that we should not dissent because there might be consequences. People like Chris Scott, Chris Barber, and Tamara Leach have taken stands for human rights, and they have paid a personal price. They should be celebrated, not discouraged. What they're doing is not the problem I'm talking about. But let me give you an example of how dissent can go wrong. When the government wants to pass a law that limits one of our charter rights, what they have to have is a pressing and substantial objective. A pressing and substantial objective is essentially an objective that's important enough to limit one of our charter freedoms. And what I think we shouldn't do is exercise our charter freedoms in a way that delivers up that pressing and substantial objective to the government. We shouldn't make their job easy for them. So how could that happen? Let me give you a hypothetical example. Let's suppose there's a protester, somebody who's protesting the participation of a transgendered person in women's sports. This person has a certain argument to make. A woman who is forced to compete against somebody with a different biology is arguably devalued. But what if that hypothetical protester uses inflammatory language that skirts the lines of hate speech? And what if that competition doesn't merely involve adults, but involves children? Now children are being exposed to this impugned speech. And all of a sudden, the government has what they see as a reason to ban protests outside of sporting facilities during competitions because they need to protect people from harmful speech against characteristics that cannot be changed and which are supported or protected by human rights legislation. That is their pressing and substantial objective, and the protester has conveniently served it up to the government. The consequences are felt by all of us because our country is incrementally less free. And that's how we lose our freedoms. We lose them one at a time. Nobody notices. when it happens that way. Here is another thing which I say we should be careful about. Consider the Supreme Court of Canada. Does anybody here believe that they have a certain ideological bent, a certain progressive bent?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if you believe that they have a certain progressive bent, do you want to appeal a case to them that is going to set a precedent for the entire country? Now, I'm not saying that we should never do that. I'm saying we should be careful about it. Because there's a certain glory in going to the Supreme Court, but there can also be a certain folly to it. The same could be said about legal challenges. The responsible dissident, in my view, will be careful in starting major legal challenges. Charter challenges are notoriously difficult to win. If you lose a charter challenge, the government will see it as a rubber stamp by the court that their legislation is charter compliant. Now, it may only be minimally compliant, but that doesn't matter because our governments have abdicated any role they have in preserving civil rights in favor of the courts. That is one of the unintended consequences of the charter. In bringing a constitutional challenge, as lawyers or as clients, we should remember that constitutional cases are not decided in a vacuum, in a factual vacuum. And that means that evidence matters, which means that you need the right applicant and the right timing. I want you to consider a case called Carter v. Canada. You've probably heard of it. It was the case that ushered in medical assistance in dying in Canada. The applicant in that case was a woman who was bound in a wheelchair because she had ALS. She was expected to lose control of her hands, her feet. She would gradually lose the ability to walk, chew, swallow, speak, and eventually even to breathe. She did not want to die that way. And regardless of what you think about medical assistance in dying, I put it to you that you'd have to be inhuman not to feel some sympathy for this woman. And the point I'm making is that the people behind that challenge had the right applicant. And not only did they have the right applicant, they had the right timing. It was 20 years since Rodriguez was decided by the Supreme Court. That was a case that had upheld criminal code provisions against medical assistance in dying. But since that time, multiple jurisdictions had allowed for some medical assistance in death. There were also papers published by royal societies recommending changes to our laws. So Carter versus Canada, not the best case in the world from my perspective, was perhaps 20 years in the making. But those people were patient. They had the right timing, they had the right applicant, and they won. And what I'm saying to you here today is that we have to emulate that type of patience if we want to win. At the very least, we cannot take the first case that comes through our doors. And we have to discourage other people from doing so. And now I'll talk more on the panel, but I want to end where I began, which is with communist Czechoslovakia. Challenging that state to uphold human rights must have seemed like it required a certain amount of self-delusion. The Czechs and the Slovaks did it. They paid a price, but they ultimately won. And the dissidents became the new government. We can win too. Our state does not wield absolute power. Let's hold the government to the law, change the things we can, but let's do it carefully so we don't make things worse before they eventually get better. Thank you very much, everyone.